Thank you. I'm pleased and honored to be here, and thank you, Mark, for inviting me. The reason I'm so excited about being here is we live right now in a golden age of international investigative reporting. I mean, I would go so far to describe it as a revolution. I'm not just talking about things like WikiLeaks or the Snowden documents, but I'm talking about widespread investigative reporting centers that are throughout the world now with highly trained, very capable investigative reporters who are doing the serious work of accountability journalism in many, many countries. I've been in journalism long enough to see this revolution and to remember what it was like before this revolution occurred. I want to take you back to the 1970s when I started in journalism and give you a little of my perspective on how things changed and the world we live in now. In 1970, investigative reporting stopped at the international border. Investigative reporters pretty much stayed in their own countries, in the United States, and they did not go outside to pursue stories. There was one very lonely exception, and that was the drug trade. In 1974, Newsday, a Long Island newspaper, went all the way to Turkey to track the heroin trail and show how heroin ended up on the streets of the United States. But drugs was really an exception. Most investigative reporting stayed in the United States. In the 1980s, I moved to the Miami Herald as an investigative reporter, and I began covering the drug trade. And there was a famous project done at the Miami Herald at that time, which was an investigation of how cocaine had corrupted public officials in the Bahamas and Prime Minister Lyndon Pindlink's administration. And the Herald did a major project pointing this out, and it really did not resonate as much as the newspaper thought it would. And it was even criticized by people within the newspaper who thought we were violating another country's sovereignty by pointing out problems that were not within our borders. It was around this time that I began to cover the Medellin cartel and cocaine in the United States, in Miami. And one of the things I noticed very quickly on the beat was Miami was not the top of the pyramid of cocaine smuggling. Miami was somewhere in the mid-level, and the top of the pyramid was in Colombia, South America. So no matter how hard I worked at exposing the connections between drug traffickers and writing about what they did with their money, it always went back to Colombia. So what I did was, on my own, in 1986, I turned to a foreign correspondent on our staff named Guy Gugliata, and I said, Guy, half of the story is in Miami, but the other half is in Colombia. If you work the Colombia end, and I work the Miami end, and we put this together, we'll have both sides of the story. And that's exactly what we did. We did a 2.5-year investigation of the Medellin cartel, ran in 1987. But the remarkable thing about that story was what a cultural bridge it proved to be. Because I was able to get information from my sources in Miami, and Guy was able to take it down to Colombia. But what really boosted our reporting was the work of Colombian reporters who could not write about the cartel in their own country under fear of death threat. More than 100 journalists were killed by the cartel. So journalists stopped writing. They stopped publishing. But they kept their notes and they kept their information. And much of this information they gave to us. And when we printed our series in 1987, and I will never forget this, 28 newspapers in Colombia published our series on the same day because much of it was their information. And one of the things this taught me was investigative stories do not respect borders. They go all over, and you have to follow them where they go. It was around this time I was also getting lots of visits from foreign journalists. And I want to talk about this because I've received 3 waves of visits from foreign journalists, and in each wave they've been profoundly different. The first wave was journalists coming from mainly Europe, but also South Africa, Germany, France, England, Ireland, Spain. And they wanted to write about the cocaine story in Miami, the Miami Vice story. This was the era of the Miami Vice. And so I was a stop on that tour. So they were mainly writing from the outside about a Miami story. But what I recognized was there's tremendous interest internationally in this cocaine story. The cocaine story is an international story. Around this time, all of our lives were changed with the end of the Cold War. And with the end of the Cold War came increasing globalization, came the increasing spread of democracy. This brought a consequent interest in investigative reporting. And one of the ways it spread was through an organization called Investigative Reporters and Editors, which is not a very well-known organization to the public, but it is to journalists. It is an organization of 5,000 journalists, investigative reporters, and it's the primary teaching and bridging organization for investigative reporters. It was founded in 1974 after an investigative reporter in Phoenix was blown up by organized crime elements that he had been investigating. That led to an organization of American journalists coming down there to complete his reporting. And after they completed his reporting, they decided to found the organization IRE. And it is a teaching organization, it's a nonprofit, it's a sharing of tools and techniques organization. But as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, 10% of IRE members were from foreign countries. Today, I think that number is about 15%. But what the American investigative reporters in IRE recognized was their investigative brethren around the world had a hunger for investigative reporting knowledge and techniques. So the IRE investigative reporters began to travel overseas to train other journalists. And then in the late 1990s, they went to Denmark. This was followed in 2001 by the first International Conference of Investigative Reporters, which occurred in Copenhagen. It involved 400 reporters from 40 countries, which shows you the level of interest. After that, things began to accelerate and really to explode. And an organization called Global Investigative Journalist Network was founded in 2003. Every 2 years to 18 months, they have an international conference. Their international conferences now draw 1,300 reporters from over 80 countries. A proliferation of investigative reporting, international investigative reporting groups have sprung up. There is the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, which has more than 160 members from more than 50 countries. There is, excuse me, lost my train of thought. What happened with these programs was the creation of a skill set in countries where we'd never seen it before. In Eastern Europe, one of the centers that was created was the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And this project, is everywhere from the Balkans to Azerbaijan. I mentioned the waves of reporters that came to see me. When I was at the Washington Post as investigations editor, these new journalists that were being trained by these nonprofit organizations would often do tours at the Washington Post. Over the years, I've spoken to probably 200 journalists. I have 81 of their cards on my desk. But in the beginning, their questions were, I would want to say, almost very basic, very primitive. The two questions they would ask the most often were, what would you do if you got a death threat? And the second question was, what would you do if somebody offers your publisher a bribe? Well, flash forward a few years. In the last 5 years, investigative reporters from all over the world are coming in, and they know how to follow money trails. They know how to investigate public officials. They know how to look into company ownership. And I remember thinking, where do they learn this? And it was from that network of groups that I just told you about. So just to give you an example, in the last year, in my own investigative unit, I have 10 full-time investigative reporters, but one of them was an investigative reporter from Hungary who embedded in my unit, and he worked as an investigative reporter side by side with my investigative reporters. I also had an investigative reporter from Ukraine who embedded with us for 2 weeks. and an investigative reporter from Azerbaijan. So this investigative reporter from Ukraine went back, and during the recent upheaval was part of that group that acquired the archive of documents known as the Yanukovych leaks, which are now pursuing as a WikiLeaks-style project. With that, I'll sum up and take your questions.
First of all, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. My name is Isaac. I come from Liberia. It's a small West African country close to Sierra Leone, Guinea, and the Ivory Coast. But it's the oldest country in Africa, actually, more than 100 years old. I'm very much interested in the disposition you just made on investigative journalism, because I have been a journalist myself for the last 17 years before becoming a diplomat. And I just thought to also share in a similar investigative stories we did when we had crisis in Liberia from 1990 up to 2003, and then there were also crises in Sierra Leone. Microsoft. We had a group of journalists just willing to report the stories from the two sides, Sierra Leonean journalists and Liberian journalists. There was this RUF trained in Liberia by our former president, Mr. Taylor, who's now in prison, and Mr. Sankor moved this group to Sierra Leone, but the borders were closed. So arms were coming from Liberia to Sierra Leone, and nobody could actually determine in Sierra Leone where these arms were coming from. So what we did, we met at the forum in Benin, just a few of us. We went to a different forum, and then the conversation just came out. So look, why don't we share notes on your side, where the arms are coming from, fighters are coming from, being trained, and you tell us on your side what is happening. And then we had an inter-country collaboration with journalists who basically, at that time, we had no much idea into investigative journalism on the note, but I just tried to make the point that if we relate our networks of journalists across cross-border, like for instance now, what is happening in Nigeria and in Cameroon, there's this Boko Haram, which is between 3 countries. You know, so journalists in that circle could probably work together, share notes and share information. We could have a lot of stories on earth, and we can have a lot of dues that were uncovered now will be into the public glare. So I highly appreciate the conversation. I think it's good based on my experience in the past. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Jesse Lutabingwa. You want to respond first, or should we take it away?
I was just going to say that that's exactly what happened in Colombia. You know, you have to, with so many stories now, you have to cross the border to get the story. And collaboration among journalists, which the reason why it's spreading so much is it's proved so effective in so many cases.
Sorry to have interfered. Again, my name is Jesse Lutabingwa. I'm from North Carolina, originally from Tanzania. Later on, I'll be sharing with you some work we are doing in Pakistan. My question to you is not necessarily about investigative reporting, but about reporting and journalism in general. And the question is, how very often it's so easy and, or at least in my view, to see a lot of sensationalized reporting and news about places like Pakistan or things that go wrong, even in Africa for that matter. My question is, how can we get journalists to report on some wonderful news, sometimes that people don't get to hear, of things that are happening right and happening well?
Well, that's a very good question. I like to say sometimes the news is like a negative seismograph. It's very sensitive about picking up anything that goes wrong, but things that go right are harder for us to understand and pick up. And I think that goes back to the talk that the ambassador from Trinidad and Tobago was talking about. Was you need to sell your good news story. You need to find a way to get that story in front of people. And so part of that is cultivating relationships with journalists and getting them to visit out in the field. If journalists go out in the field and they see a good news story, they're more apt to write about it than if you tell them about or you send them an email. So I think it's important to develop relationships with journalists that you trust and tell them, you know, don't try to sweep the bad news under the rug, but let them know that if they want to be balanced, there's also a good news story that they can tell.
I was wondering what role you'd see as somebody coming a little bit from the background of media. What role do you see media playing when it comes to cultural diplomacy? For example, Germany, the country where ICD is based now, is quite involved in actually, let's say, governmental cultural diplomacy. Deutsche Welle, I'm sure you know. Deutsche Welle is the main international TV broadcaster from Germany. As far as I know, it's still the fourth largest international broadcaster in the world. I think it's CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and then Deutsche Welle. So basically, governmentally funded media organization, only broadcast outside of Germany. So Germans actually can't see Deutsche Welle unless they have satellite or this and that. Fascinating example where the government says this is important. We really want to have our own media organization promoting, let's say, news from Germany around the world. The world doesn't seem to mind the German example, but I wonder, you know, how would they feel if there was an American governmentally funded media organization, you know, officially governmentally funded, doing something like that? What role does media have when it comes to cultural diplomacy? I guess the first part of my question is, should it be governmental in any case or not? And what role maybe do even citizen journalists have at also building bridges sometimes between cultures and country? How relevant is the role of media, let's say, when it comes to cultural diplomacy? When I say cultural diplomacy, I don't mean in the classical sense, winning the hearts and minds of foreign audiences, but really cultural diplomacy in the sense, how do we build dialogue, understanding, and trust, which I think a lot of your work is actually doing. But at a macro level, how do you see the role of the media when it comes to cultural diplomacy?
Do we have about an hour? That's a big question. You know, first it starts with what is the media now? There's an explosion of media. Media is everywhere. It's on your mobile phone, it's on your desktop, it's on TV, it's on the radio, and it's changing so fast and transforming so quickly. So I would say, you know, it goes back to the marketplace of ideas. The media is this frothing marketplace of ideas that is spitting out culture, politics, news, you know, at an incredible rate 24/7. It's almost impossible to keep up with, and therefore hard to control. I think it harder than ever is how to control the image, how to control the story when it's coming out from so many directions. I think that, you know, we've had a long history with government-funded media, you know, through our public broadcasting system, and there is a role for that. They produce a product that is different, and some people like. It's controversial. Some people say the marketplace can take care of that. And today, with so many different kinds of media, you know, we're all trying to find our footing, but controlling the cultural conversation right now, when it can be controlled on Twitter in less than 140 words, and then figuring out, well, where does the 10,000 word story that appears in the New Yorker, where is the two-hour documentary? The only way I can get my head around it and stay sane is I focus on my little investigative reporting world, and I leave those larger questions to the culture to wrestle out on its own.
Well, thank you for your response and also for your lecture. And I think just to follow up on that one point, I think in essence, the kinds of reporting you're doing can actually have a very big impact and also a very positive impact. I'm thinking of one of the most famous examples of cultural diplomacy in the Cold War, which was the jazz ambassadors. Many would argue the reason the jazz ambassadors were so successful, first of all, because of jazz, of course, was very attractive at the time. Secondly, because of the authenticity. When the American government sent jazz ambassadors around the world, they sent a very diverse group of ambassadors, very often individuals who also disagreed with the American government and actually were critical of the American government. For example, Louis Armstrong, etc. who would talk about the situation of race, segregation, et cetera, in the USA. And that actually had a positive impact. Whereas, in the Soviet Union at the time, you don't disagree with the government. You don't say something critical. And the fact that actually the American government was supporting these individuals to go, and also those who were actually critical of the government, was very positive in terms of freedom of expression. I think this is very relevant today, as you see American embassies closing Twitter pages or reopening them or this and that, depending on the political climate at the time. So I think this aspect of freedom of expression is super important. And I think definitely the work that you're doing in terms of investigative reporting and beyond can actually have a very positive impact in many ways. So maybe if you could all please join me in expressing our sincere gratitude to Jeff Leen for an excellent presentation. We're really grateful to have had you here. Thank you.